So Ed asked me to come today. He said, so I just need you to explain how the financial system works, the history of how we got there, and then the other thing we're supposed to build. Oh yeah, and talk about yourself a little bit too. In 20 minutes. So I'm going to do what I can to keep to that time. Hey Dave, you want to hit that so the timer starts? So as to talk about democratic finance to me is, well, first of all, it's an intellectual challenge because democracy and finance don't go together very well. In fact, I'd argue that finance, as we have it today, is the opposite of democracy. Finance is the major tool in which they try to keep the resources that would allow us to do it ourselves out of our hands. It's also somewhat of a moral and emotional challenge for me to talk about finance. It's very intentionally taught to us as the driest, most boring thing there is. As Marnie said, finance is scary. And from what I've seen, it is probably the single force with the greatest moral horror stories to tell that I know in the world. So I'll try to tell this story just in a couple of pieces here. I'll start with the major point that finance is power, most clearly expressed in our society. And once upon a time, if a society built a pyramid, it was a demonstration of great amounts of political organization and control, credible state power, belief in a common system. Nowadays, you can build a pyramid if you just have enough money. And the major role of the state is just to enforce the system which keeps those people having that much money, and then to hand out a couple of trinkets to keep us from revolting. But power itself, when we think about what is political power, we think the thing that can move people to do stuff. What moves people to do stuff more than money? It's all about the Benjamins. So, I gotta put the Benjamin up. So this symbol moves more people than all the things that Jessica and Aaron got to talk about today. That this is actually what more people organize their lives around. That money in our system is power. That's the place I want to start with. So how do we get here? Where does finance come from? Well, I'm going to dial back not just to the beginning of the 20th century or something, not even the beginning of capitalism. Forget all about the world of European colonialism. Go back a long time ago to 3000 BC, around the time of the agricultural revolution. You go ahead and click just once. Yeah. So in the agricultural revolution, in agrarian societies, you realize that, and I'll explain what this means. You can just contemplate. If you take grain, if I give you some seed and you plant it, it makes a lot more seed. There is a surplus. You can give it back to me and still have enough left to feed your family. If everything goes well. Now, in a place like Sumeria, where they were between the Tigris and Euphrates River, that had a tendency to move one way or the other a lot of times, sometimes when you took seed, you planted it, it would have children. And from those children, you could give back a surplus to someone who might have loaned you the seed and keep the rest. But sometimes the river would move, and it would literally wash those seeds and their children away. That's this guy. So the Sumerians came up with a system of having a common granary, where everyone would borrow seed from it, plant, and then they could give back some of their surplus and have enough for themselves, living in autonomy. And when your seed was washed away, they lend you seed, there was no children of those seeds. They were washed away, so there's nothing to return. In fact, the common granary restored seed for you the next year. That's how they dealt with the changing of the river. Go ahead and click back to the next one. So, but then this amazing thing happened. I'll argue, one of the most powerful lies that has ever been created and that we're still under today. Now, Sumeria lasted for thousands of years, way longer than the United States has been around, or even capitalism. So when we think about something happening quickly, we have to think about it in context of people who lived a lot longer than we have. Human beings have been around for 150,000 years. The Sumerians were around for thousands. At some point during that time, in the ancient world, the idea that when I give you seeds and they have children, if you have extra children, give some of it back, that real thing, those tangible seeds and their children, that was eclipsed by the metaphor, by the concept of debt. That we write down how many seeds I lent you. And even if it washes away, well, you still owe me those seeds. She's like, but there are no children. There aren't. What surplus of children am I supposed to pay you back with? There's no result. You still owe that. And the concept of debt becomes deified. This idea that money is abstracted from actual things on earth is the great lie that we've been told. And what ends up happening in their system is this centralized commons, which was meant as a redistribution of surplus, has the opposite effect. In fact, those who lose their grain, they have to give back to those who loaned it to them. Of course, what can they give back at that point? They lost their crop. They give back their labor. They give back their land. And in fact, the first laws in the books of humankind, the Code of Hammurabi, describe a lot about finance. And among them, they describe that if someone cannot pay you back their debt, they have to give you their land so you can become an aristocrat, or they give you their wife and children and as their slaves. And the very first laws in the books, if you watch TV, you'd think law is all about murder, and murder trials. But murder's been around for 150,000 years, as long as human beings have been around, as far as I can tell. Whereas laws have been around for about 5,000, and the things they describe weren't murder. They describe debt, and they describe slavery, and they describe aristocracy. And in one sweep of the ancient pen or tablet, all three were brought into existence at the same time. It's important to mention this moral change, just how deep it got, that we went from a system where if your stuff was swept away, the commons would help you, to not only they take from you, but you're morally wrong. We talked about self-image. People brought this up. That's why I decided to bring this up too. Those in debt who can't pay their debts, there's not much worse shame. They have shame, even though they're giving away what little they have, their wife and children. And this exists in societies across the world. That debt is actually the most common form of creation of slavery. And I'll bring it up to the modern day in the colonial system. Most times that people conquered other people or they colonized them, first thing they did was levy a debt. When the French conquered Madagascar and colonized Madagascar, the first thing they did was levy a debt. For what? For the cost of the invasion and the cost of developing their country. Now, to this day, the Malagasy of Madagascar still owe the French money. They have had to pay back even when there was fever running through their country, and instead of paying for medicine or paying for mosquito nets, they had to pay back the French. The French have put down open rebellions against this to the tune of killing over 100,000 people trying to rebel against this debt. And the only time there's been moral outrage in the world community is when the Malagasy threatened to not pay their debt. This isn't 5,000 years ago, this is now. And this is the story of the global south, which has owed money to the global north for now since colonialism. They've repaid that debt many times over, the third world debt crisis, as they called it in the last century. And yet they still owe it without having barely made a dent in the principal. They still owed it even though people who borrowed the money were mostly crony dictators of the American cronies who weren't elected, put the money in a Swiss bank account, and yet the people of that country still owe that debt. And when they talk about not repaying it, the moral eye cast on those debtors, like it did to Greece. This is the dominant system we live in today. So that's how finance got to where we are, that great lie. So the last piece of that is just how powerful the lie of finance is. What really terrifies me is how everybody's being encouraged to put their money in a 401k. We all take our money, put it in, and what do we see from our 401k? What does it tell us about where that money went? We see the bottom line at the end of the year, and that's it. I'll get another 401k because it had a better return than that one. We all play just a little bit in that roulette game that they're using to control the rest of us. So the returns that you might have gotten might be because a company decided to close a factory in Detroit to move it to somewhere where the people were easily exploitable under a dictator, and they made some money and you got a little piece of return, while you are someone who lives in Detroit and your pension fund was invested in that 401k, the pension fund, before they took it away. And that's how you lost your jobs. And this, the system, all those values are abstracted from the financial transaction. All the different things that you do, that money goes in, it goes into someone's life, it goes into someone's labor, it builds things, it destroys things. None of that's seen. They're all hidden behind the screen of finance, and all you see is that return. So I like to say that Money isn't just, you don't just have extractive finance. Finance is extraction perfected. It occludes all the damage you do. And literally we'd say like financing is like the carpet bombing of the economy. You don't even see the villages you destroy. And that's not a metaphor. So finance is extraction. The money morality literally trumps the morality of people. Debt you owe matters. Debt is more important than people's life and liberty, their land. That all can be taken away. Medicine can be taken away from children to repay that debt. That's the lie we've been given. So non-extractive finance or financial commons would obviously be going back to that earlier Sumerian practice. It would be destroying the idol of that metaphor of debt and returning it to only real things. Debt has, try to read this one. So debt has become what those who experience hardship owe to those who own the surplus. That's what debt is now. Those in hardship owe to those who own the surplus. Debt was once what those who happened upon surplus owed back to their society. That's non-extractive finance. So I'm going to talk about, I'm halfway through a little bit, so a little more. So I'm going to talk about where do we go from this today. That's where we got here 5,000 years ago. Where do we go today? Well, paint a little bit of a picture of the world today. It's going to be a little bit more depressing stuff, and then I'll finally get to the good stuff. So the world today, we live in a world that is so financialized. It's like Sumeria times 1,000. We live in a world that is dominated by finance. In our country, there are record corporate profits as people get poorer. And yet, out of those record corporate profits, a record percentage of it goes to finance. 40%. 40% of all the surplus all of us make just goes to the financial industry. We live in the most financialized society in history. They make up the bulk of the 1%. In 1971, the US went off the gold standard, and dollars became the world's gold. When people, like when China would make stuff and need to store, have a place to store their value, they wouldn't get gold anymore. They bought American dollars. The American economy was so dominant that we didn't have to have gold anymore. We just printed money and people took it as gold. Now you could argue this is the greatest natural resource that any country has ever managed to acquire. That we could print money because our economy is so big and stable and they liked it so much that they would take our printed money as their gold. What have we done with that gold? Well, for example, in 2008 we had the financial crisis where a lot of people and a lot of banks, all the things they thought they'd bought weren't worth nearly as much as they thought they were. So what happened to the banks in that case? Well, you all heard about the $750 billion bailout that they were given. But that was literally peanuts. Well, not literally. Okay, that was figuratively peanuts. Thank you. Compared to the $16 trillion in what they call quantitative easing that the Treasury Department printed to buy from a bank their stuff that was no longer worth what they thought it was for the original price, and then sell it back to them to the new price. That would be like going to your house and say, oh, you bought your house for $100,000, it's only worth $60. It's cool, I'll give you $100, and then you can buy it back from me for $60. That's what the US Treasury did with our gold to the banking industry at the tune of $16 trillion. Yes, that's as much as our national debt. We didn't experience inflation from it because we have the world's gold currency. That's what it was used for. Since 2008, there's been as many billionaires created in this country as all of history before it. Because that money went somewhere and it didn't go to many of us. This makes a lot of things difficult besides being really annoying. There's a giant pile of money out there. We can build real economy things, and someone can come with money they just got given because they happen to be in the private consortium of banks gets money from the Federal Reserve. They can just come and buy it from us. They can walk into our town where we've been working really hard to build a community grocery store and offer us $10 million, $20 million. It doesn't really matter because their money was given to them. It didn't come from their blood, bones, or dirt. That giant pile of money is really difficult. It's very seductive, and it's very hard to fight against. In fighting against it, first of all, we have to remember one really important thing, the difference between consumer and producer capital. I'll put this out there as one last little lesson. That consumer capital is what we used to buy things. Productive capital, that's like what Ed, when he talked about that day back in February 12th, 18-something, when 20 ministers got together, he said, what do you want at the end of slavery? He said, we want land so we can produce, so we can do for ourselves. A very smart man named Ed Whitfield once commented on a reframing of that in a glib way, and nowadays we want 40 acres and a Bentley. And Ed said, well, you really missed the point of the difference between productive and consumer capital. A Bentley's not going to help you do for yourself. And understanding to not have what we build be seduced away from us with the promise of consumerism is a really important key to us getting out of this. So we have one big hope in what occurred here. That same giant pile of money which looms over us is also the weakness for these capitalists, because they don't know where to put it all. All those billionaires want to put that money somewhere where they get enough interest they can live without doing anything. They don't know where to put it. That's why it keeps getting put into housing bubbles, et cetera. So we have a chance. Whereas if we're strategic enough and we leverage our power, we can get a lot of that money cheaply. We can get the money we can to build the things we need. That's part of the just transition. Before this dollar thing collapses, you grab as much as you can in a really strategic way to build our new economy. So that brings us to the destroy the working world. You can hit the slide. So what we've been trying to build, the working world, as Ed pointed out, I lived in Argentina for 7 years, moved there 11 years ago to work with factories taken over by the workers. We started a non-extractive loan fund. That meant that factories taken over by the workers could get capital from us, and if it worked out, they'd pay back their surplus into that common fund. If it didn't work out, they wouldn't pay anything back. They had ever any danger of losing their factories. We've taken that non-extractive practice, brought it to the United States. Recently, we started a financial cooperative, actually a lot of people in this room. It brought together 27, or the first meeting, which is only the first, this is not the end of it at all. First meeting brought together 27 organizations from 10 parts of the country to start local loan funds that would own capital in common to be invested in productive capital in their locality. The idea of this, one, is to leverage our power. The more we band together, when we go to the financial markets, the more power we have to deal with that financial market. One little tiny loan project somewhere that wants to start a worker cooperative is dead out there in the financial market. Together, hundreds of projects aggregated, that's when we can have some market power. That's the strategic way to access that big pile of money and get money in. At that point in the system, this has to be a system where real things and human lives trumps debt. Capital is just a tool for people to use, unlike our current system, which, as we know too well, people are a tool for capital. In this system, capital has to be something people can use. Debt is no longer a metaphor of something people have to pay back no matter what happens. This system will redistribute the surplus to places that need it and try to allow real economic growth to happen. It is the beginning, a very humble beginning, and hopefully joined with a lot of other opportunities to restart, to create a new financial system based on the old ideas of non-extraction and financial commons. Importantly, it still has a lot of local control, because Ed brought up the importance of local. The idea is all local decisions are still made locally. You join together for what you need, you go back home and do what you need locally. So one of my last bits here, I've talked a lot about history and abstract stuff, and the reason I decided to put up pictures was because I wanted to show some people. So I'm going to show what does this actually look like, and go ahead and you can hit advance. It looks like people in Argentina who they were in the greatest bankruptcy that any country had gone through at the time, who managed to buy their own factories, to borrow money to run those factories without ever having fear of losing those same factories, where they've gone from 200 factories to 300 to 500. They've grown in a declining economy and a growing economy. There are now thousands and thousands of workers in Argentina who own their own means of production, who are doing it for themselves. You can hit it again. It looks like the people of New Era Windows, who borrowed about $650,000 to buy their factory from their corrupt former owner, who are now out-competing that former owner, who got $20 million to start another factory that, by the way, just went bankrupt. And about 3 or 4 of the workers were hired from New Era to join, hired from that bankruptcy to join New Era. It should look like the workers of New Era are getting $5 million to start their own factory. That's what's next. They shouldn't have had to perform the feats of heroism they did to make $600,000 compete against a $20 million business. Go ahead and click again. It looks like this story that's happening in Bedford-Stuyvesant, where organic grocery store started by new gentrifiers. It's being bought by local residents who work there. We call it the ungentrification. There's 3 more in Bed-Stuy that match like that one. Go ahead and click one more. And it's the story of this family who, 30 years ago, the couple on the left, they their daughter was going to school, and they realized that schooling wasn't good enough where they lived for their daughter, so they started an after-school program and a pre-K program in the basement of her father-in-law. 30 years later, they have a 6-story building. They have 68 teachers. And they want to retire. They want to sell their business. But land speculators have told them they'll pay them far more than their business is worth for the land. They refuse to sell. 5 minutes, that's so generous. Okay, I'm going to chill. They refused to sell ever, and we came to visit them, and we talked to them about the possibility of a financial commons being used by their workers to buy the school for the workers. Tears started rolling down their cheeks. The business broker who was there, who used to work at Citibank, he kind of went bonkers as we moved around the table to sit on the same side of the table and actually look over the financials and together come up with what a fair price would be for them in their retirement and all the 30 years of incredible amount of work they did and what a fair price of the workers would be to buy it from. It was kind of awesome watching this sort of solidarity economy transaction totally blow away the extractive transaction he was hoping would happen. And it was a wonderful moment for me. We showed him a video of New Era, especially one that had a lot of Ricky, and that was when really it clicked. And for me, it was a really, it was a big moment to have my late friend Ricky, to see him still organizing and still moving people forward. So that was a good moment. I won't end there. I have one last thing to end on. A lot of people always ask, like, what are we fighting for? 1, 2, 3, and you know, and what do the people in Occupy Wall Street want? Well, maybe they don't know. What do people want? You know, maybe do we want maybe $15 an hour? Do we want more paid family? Do we want more consumer capital on this side of it? In the ancient world, when the lie, that great lie, was told to us, it was newer, that debt was just a real thing that was more important than human life. Revolutions had a very clear ask. They always sought to cancel debt and redistribute the land being productive capital. So for me, I try to think now, what should we be demanding? And it's the destruction of our debt, which is our chains, and taking the means of production, which is our freedom. Thank you all.